So today I'm going to do an overview of the Hitbox MIG200 welder. And I actually have two welders that are both the MIG200 model, but the interface is slightly different. I'm going to explain the difference and show you how to use them. I'm going to start with this one here. The biggest noticeable difference is this electrical whip that comes out at the front. And it was just kind of hanging there, didn't really know what it was for until I did a little bit of research and found out how to use it. But in order for me to explain how to use it properly, I have to explain the difference between the two different types of MIG welding. So there's basically two different types of wires that you can get. One of them is the flux cord, right here, flux cord gasless welding wire. And then this one here, it doesn't actually say on it, but this is just a straight iron that has not a flux core in it. And depending on which wire you use, the setting has to be different. Now I have a handy little chart that I made up, and the most important, or I guess the easiest way to remember, is if you're looking at where's the ground. If you're going, use stick, like here, the ground has to be plugged into the negative, which you can see up here is clearly labeled at this one right here. That's the negative. Now if I want to use gas on the MIG welder, again the ground has to be at the negative. If I want to use the flux core wire, the ground has to be on the positive. And if I want to use my TIG attachment over there, the ground also has to be on the positive. So let's look at the very first one, the stick. I'm going to take my stick welder, and the ground clamp has to be on the negative. So I'm going to take that here and plug it in to the negative. And then I'm going to use the electrode holder and plug that one in to the positive. Turn on the machine. And then under the setting, I'm going to zoom in here for a little bit. Under the setting, I'm going to use this button to go over to arc. And then all I need to do is adjust my amperage right here. And I'm ready to weld whichever way I want to go. One thing to notice is that this button can actually switch between amperage and voltage. Now this doesn't apply to the arc. Once I switch over to MIG or lift TIG, I can show you. For now, this just adjusts the amperage accordingly, and the voltage stays the same. And that's how you use the stick welder on the Hitbox 200. Now, if I go to the next one, for the MIG, if I want to use gas, again, I want to make sure that I pay attention to where the ground is, and that is negative. So right now the ground clamp is plugged into the negative, but when I use the MIG attachment, I have to use this little whip, and I actually have to plug the whip into the positive. And then I go to the back and I have to connect my gas inlet to a bottle like this, which should be C25, 25% carbon dioxide and 75% argon. It is possible to use 100% argon with a MIG, but not very well, because the thermal conductivity of argon is not nearly as good as the C25. So it's definitely recommended to have the gas that has the 25% CO2 in it. Once I have plugged in the wires the correct way, I can go to the control panel and use the selection button to switch over from arc to MIG. Now with MIG, there's two options that I have. I can either go flux core or solid wire. So because right now the ground is on the negative, which means we're talking about the gas MIG, I have to switch the panel over to a solid core wire. And now all that's left is to adjust the amperage or the voltage, depending on how you want it. You can see there's a little LED that lights up the A, and there's a little dark one that says V. So if you take this button, push it in, it switches from amperage to voltage and back, amperage, voltage. So if I want to adjust the voltage, that's where I do it. If I want to switch the amperage, that's where I can do that, and the voltage automatically adjusts. The third option here is using the flux core wire, and that's what I have in my machine right now. So if I look under here, this wire is flux core wire, and I do not have it hooked up to any sort of gas, which obviously I won't need for the flux core wire. Now if I want to use that option, I look at my chart, and the flux core wire says ground positive. So the ground clamp has to be plugged into the positive. So I'll disconnect the whip and plug in the ground to positive. And then I'm going to take this little whip and plug it into the negative. And on my selection panel, I switch over from solid core to flux core wire, and I'm ready to go. Again, adjusting the amperage here, and if I want to switch over to voltage, I push this button, and now I can adjust the voltage. And I am good to weld with my flux core wire. Now the last option that this welder can handle is the lift TIG, and you can tell it has to be ground positive. So if I look at the ground clamp, it is plugged into the positive, but because I don't want to use my MIG attachment, I'm going to disconnect this whip, okay? But instead, I'm going to use my TIG attachment that has two ends, and one of them will go into the positive end, and the other one will screw into the bottle that has the argon. Now with the TIG, you have to use 100% argon. This C25 gas is not going to work for the TIG because the temperatures are just too high. And then all you got to do is lift or open up the little gas and touch the metal with, or I guess I should show you over here, touch the metal with the tungsten electrode and lift it off, and then you can weld it with a filler rod just like you would normally. So to summarize, there is several different options for this welder. We have the regular stick welder, we have the TIG welding, and we have the MIG welding, which is also split up into gasless, which is the flux core, and the regular shielding gas. Depending on which one you want to use, the ground clamp is the key. So for the stick, you plug in the ground clamp into the negative. For regular shielding gas MIG, you also keep the ground clamp on the negative. For flux core MIG welding, you take the ground clamp and plug it into the positive, and for TIG you also keep it at the positive. Now for MIG, you have to use this whip to plug it into whichever one is not being used by the ground clamp, and that diverts the electricity to the MIG gun. And the only other thing to look out for is the TIG attachment has this, which needs to be plugged into an argon bottle with a regulator, obviously. And that summarizes the MIG200 with this front panel.